Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3, where we're providing an overview of the standard and an overview of the changes for anyone preparing to transition to R2V3. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Program Manager at Perry Johnson Registrars. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on this slide, give you an idea of what we'll be covering today. We'll kick things off with a short slide or two about Perry Johnson Registrars, who we are, what we do. I will highlight some of the benefits of certification to a standard like R2V3. We will cover a brief overview of the transition timeline. We are nearing the end of the transition period, so I'm not going to spend as long as I did on this material in previous webinars. If you haven't already scheduled your transition audit, I encourage you to do so. So we'll cover that transition expectation at a high level, and then we'll spend the majority of the time covering the revisions, providing an overview of the standard, but highlighting the changes between the R2V3 standard and its previous version, R2 2013. We'll cover some of the information that you need to know to prepare for your R2V3 audit coming up. For anyone who is not transitioning, but is instead pursuing initial certification to R2V3, we will close with a summary of the certification process, what you can expect, what that looks like, and we'll allow time at the end for any questions. Feel free to type your questions in to the question field at any point throughout the presentation, but I will be saving those for the end. Today's presentation is being recorded. A copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slides will be made available on PJR's website. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have certified companies to a variety of standards, and while this list of countries in which we've certified clients is not necessarily an all-inclusive list, it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a certification body. PJR is accredited to grant certification to a variety of standards, as I indicated, including the subject of today's webinar, which is R2V3. Some of these other standards may look familiar to you with the need to integrate environmental health and safety certifications in order to qualify for R2V3. Benefits of certification vary by industry, by standard, by organization, by location. There's a number of variables here, but we do have some common elements that I'm going to go through quickly for anyone who is considering certification or trying to decide if certification might be right for them. The standard itself represents a commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling electronics as well as electronic components. So just that commitment in and of itself is one of the benefits. Going through the process of implementing and maintaining the standard requirements drives improvement for an organization's environmental health and safety performance. That's the abbreviation there, EHS, environmental health and safety. You'll see that acronym throughout my slides. The standard also represents and provides, through its implementation, a framework for meeting customer and/or regulatory requirements. Since those requirements are built into the standard, that is an output of the process of implementing the standard requirements and maintaining the standard requirements to maintain your certification. It also drives management commitment and employee engagement level improvement, can provide a competitive advantage over companies who do not have the same certification, and or an improved public image. Again, we go back to that first bullet point, that commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling electronics. Being able to advertise the certification is advertising that same commitment. It can provide a perception of sustainability, responsibility, environmental awareness, proactivity, things like that. There can be other potential financial benefits, not listed here necessarily. Perhaps your insurance company would offer a discount for a certification that incorporates health and safety requirements. Again, some of these vary by location. Implementing the requirements of the standard also assists an organization in achieving its strategic objectives and or its stakeholder requirements. And the standard is able to be integrated with other business management systems. The transition information for R2V3, I've left in these next couple of slides for reference. Again, a copy of the slides will be made available on PGR's website. And this is also not the first time that we have offered this particular webinar. So if you are needing further details, I recommend you go back and watch a recording from one of the earlier offerings of this one. So I'm just going to touch on a couple key points based on where we currently stand in the remainder of the transition period. A copy of the R2V3 standard, as well as the code of practices and the other documents that you would need to prepare for your transition audit, can be found on CERI's website. They have their document library. They also have a repository for their advisories. Advisory 22 is CERI's transition plan for R2V3. I recommend that all clients and auditors keep a close eye on the CERI website, their knowledge base page. They're keeping updated with information about R2V3 in lieu of a formal guidance document. There are allowances for the transition audit to be conducted partially or entirely virtually, if that is something that would work for your organization. You can have a transition audit according to Advisory 22 that is up to 50% virtual for R2V3 time without any additional requirements. However, Advisory 24 allows for fully virtual transition audits if the audit will be conducted by an auditor trained to those specific requirements, and it does enact additional requirements, including the loss of an integration discount for R2V3 time if it was applied, or the calculation of audit time in an integrated manner. So I do like to give clients a heads up about that in advance. You can have a fully virtual transition audit potentially, but there are additional requirements that you would be subject to. The other point I want to mention on this slide is the PJR transition deadline. So CERI's transition deadline is the end of June. PJR from the beginning has been recommending a transition audit deadline of the end of March. If you are still in the process of scheduling your transition audit, I recommend you do that right away. If you chose to have your audit after the end of March, you are very likely to have a lapse in certification because of various requirements and activities that take place after the audit. Having your audit in the first quarter decreases the likelihood of a lapse in certification, gives us time to work on the things that we need to work on behind the scenes, reviewing the package. It also gives you some time to close out the NCRs with sufficient responses and a revisit. We'll talk more about that later, but I did want to highlight the PGR recommended deadline. Since we're so far into the transition period, I'll be skipping this slide, but as I mentioned, I did leave it in here for your review if it's relevant to you. Again, the final deadline for transition for SERI is June 30th, 2023. And here's a transition timeline. We are almost all the way through the transition period at this point. I'm also not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. The standard was revised for a number of reasons, as all standard revisions are. There are some common factors with standard revisions, and then there are some R2 specific ones. In this case, it's a combination of lessons learned, feedback from a number of groups, trying to grow with the diversity of the industry, ensure effective implementation, remove any language that was confusing, in addition to the common factors like making sure it is applicable to a wide range of sectors, that it's flexible enough, but still maintaining the rigor of the standard, that it continues to be relevant within the market and compatible with other standards it relies upon. Now we'll move into the key changes in R2V3. I want to stress that no changes were made to the intent of the standard. So we still see the idea that reuse is the main goal, followed by recycling when reuse is all attempts to reuse are exhausted, or there's no market for reuse of electronics because of their age or something like that. You can see right off the bat, based on the screenshot of the table of contents, that the structure of the standard has changed. R2V3 is divided into core requirements. There are 10 core requirements instead of 13 provisions, and also into process requirements, or the appendices. We find the process requirements in the appendices, and you'll find that they don't all apply to all R2V3 organizations. They'll depend on their scope of operations or the processes that they conduct, and we'll talk more about that later. There is even more emphasis on reuse in R2V3 compared to R2 2013, and some of the requirements are certainly more prescriptive in nature. Another key change in R2V3 is the creation of an R2 equipment categorization document. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. It is not auditable, but it is required to be used in conjunction with the R2V3 standard. Another key change is requiring a certified quality management system for certain process requirements or appendices. With R2 2013, as with R2V3, the prerequisites include certified EHS management systems. Commonly, we see ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, or RIOS. Those would be the two most common combinations there. Additionally, we've seen R2V3 clients need to add a certified QMS if they didn't have RIOS. So we would see ISO 9001 with ISO 14001 and 45001 most commonly, although there are other standards that would meet this requirement, and you can find those on SERI's website. There are no significant changes to the introduction in the sense that it's still a very comprehensive standard. The legality of trade is still required, and the applicability is very similar to R2 2013. The key change in the introduction section would be references to the REC, or the R2 equipment categorization document, since it is to be used hand in hand with the standard. And we'll talk more about that later. Also, no significant changes to the auditability of the standard. I mentioned earlier, R2 certificates will vary in their process requirements by facility. Each R2V3 facility will qualify only for those process requirements that are applicable to them, and those will be listed on the certificate. I encourage you to review the definitions. There are some new terms and some revised definitions of existing terms from R2 2013. So I created a little cheat sheet here. Core Requirement 1 houses the scope requirements. It talks about everything that needs to be included in the audits and the certification. It also prompts the inclusion of services that might be taking place outside of the facility. So things like offsite collection, mobile data destruction, services being performed at a customer's location, things like this. So Core 1 focuses on including everything that is supposed to be included in the scope of the management system, the scope of the audits, and the scope of certification. That could include processes, that could include business names, that could include applicable process requirements. We're making sure that we have everything included that needs to be considered. Some of that information gets reflected directly on the certificate as dictated by the standard and/or the code of practices. A new requirement to R2V3 found in Core 1 is that the R2 facility needs to publicly communicate and maintain on an ongoing basis a list of other locations that are not certified to R2, but are owned and/or operated by the R2 facility and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So on the previous slide, when we talk about everything that needs to be included, what we don't see is a requirement for all sites to be certified. That is up to the discretion of the organization. However, if there are locations that are not certified, they need to be publicly communicated, perhaps via a website, for example. There's also a requirement that an organization can't pursue certification to R2V3 for 2 years if they were found to have marketed their R2 certification deceptively or participated in illegal acts or activities. This is something that is maintained and monitored by SIRI to prevent those companies from pursuing certification in that time. Core Requirement 2 focuses on the hierarchy of responsible management strategies. There are no significant changes here because, again, the intent of the standard is unchanged. We see references to different sections here because the structure and numbering of the standard is different than R2 2013, but reuse is still the first choice wherever practical or possible, followed by materials recovery and ultimately disposal as a last resort. Core Requirement 3 focuses on the environmental health and safety management system. The standard recognizes ISO 14001 and ISO 45001 for certified EHS management systems or the RIOS standard. In addition to those prerequisites, Core Requirement 3 requires the organization to have a process to periodically evaluate their exposures to hazardous substances. Examples might include mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, and so on. In the event that higher risk activities such as materials recovery are utilized, industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements may apply. But within Core Requirement 3, the requirement is only speaking to having a process to evaluate those exposures. It also specifies minimum accommodations and requirements for workers, such as providing sanitary facilities and preventing consumption in contaminated areas. Core Requirement 4 focuses on legal and other requirements. There is a requirement to document the applicable legal requirements related to export, transit, and/or import to be able to demonstrate the legality of any international shipments. This applies to electronics or materials transferred by the R2 facility, as well as R2 controlled streams, which is one of the new terms in R2V3 I encourage you to get familiar with, including shipments made by downstream vendors to final disposition or the first R2 facility. This is a little bit wordy, but what it means is whether the R2V3 facility is directly exporting those materials or importing those materials, or if it's conducted by a downstream vendor, this requirement still applies. You have to track the legality of shipments as an R2V3 facility all the way through final disposition, or if you have an R2V3 facility in your downstream chain, you can stop there. If that's your tier 1, then you don't have to track it any further than that. If it's a couple tiers down, you would track it until you got to that first R2V3 tier. Anytime we see R2 facility in the R2V3 standard, they are referring to R2V3. It does not recognize R2 2013 certification. Core Requirement 4 also requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations, and that the R2V3 facility notify their certification body if they receive a notice of violation that requires action or follow-up within 30 days. This can't wait until your next audit to be brought up to us. Core 4 prohibits child enforced labor. Prison labor is prohibited as well unless certain criteria are met. And Core 4 also requires a non-discrimination policy. Tracking throughput requirements can be found in Core Requirement 5. This requires a summary report be maintained for all inbound and outbound material transactions. This section also requires that the records contain certain criteria, including accurate dates, detailed descriptions, and so on. Total inventory levels are required to be maintained below any applicable limits, such as those specified by legal requirements, the R2 facility's closure plan, etc. R2V3 requires that R2 controlled streams and/or materials with a negative value not be stored more than 1 year. There are some exceptions to this. If components have been evaluated or tested and inventoried according to Appendix C, test and repair, those can be stored for longer than a year. And also, the second exception would be items being stored waiting for export due to the lack of response from the relevant governing authority to permit that export, as long as the R2 facility submitted the paperwork required by the appropriate time. So if you are waiting on the governing authority to approve an export, you can store it beyond that year, but you can't wait until that year is up to submit for approval to export. Core Requirement 6 houses, I would say, a significant portion of the standard requirements: sorting, categorization, and processing. This section is significantly restructured, and here again we see references to the REC. Core 6 requires a documented process for evaluating, sorting, and categorizing controlled and processed materials with prescribed subjects. I've included some examples of what needs to be included. This is not an all-inclusive list. All of the materials need to be managed and processed as an R2 controlled stream per the R2V3 requirements unless it meets certain criteria. Some examples of this might be material that was processed and already categorized by an R2V3 upstream, in which case you can use the REC category that the R2V3 upstream identified. If it was processed and categorized by a non-R2V3 facility, and you have an understanding of their evaluation and sampling process, and that you have verified with your own sampling. Another example would be if you can receive or obtain test and verification and sanitization records for each device, then you wouldn't have to conduct sampling. You would have a record or records of the outputs of the functionality testing and the sanitization results for all of those units. Or it ceases to be an R2 controlled stream. And again, your familiarity with these definitions is going to be key. All equipment and components need to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC. Data evaluations are to include any connected user accounts and services as well. Any equipment or components that may contain data need to be controlled per core requirement 7. We need to assume it does have data until we have proven that it doesn't. Equipment or components not permitted to be reused, sold, or donated according to written contracts are still subject to the requirements of Core 7 and Appendix E. Identification requirements for equipment and components that are evaluated and found to be capable of reuse are spelled out in Core 6, as well as references to the applicable appendix requirements. There are specific requirements in Core 6 as well for electronics or components that were evaluated and categorized as an unrestricted stream according to the REC, such as handling them separately from the R2 controlled streams, being able to justify their classification as an unrestricted stream, tracking records, including any reason for return, and so on. Those can be found in Core 6 as well. There are specific requirements for transferring functioning products. Those are items that have been tested and their functionality has been demonstrated in accordance with the REC. There are requirements for labeling, although with R2V3, or identification and tracking, I should say, although with R2V3, physical labels are not necessarily required. An organization might use a different method of labeling and identifying, such as barcodes. Core 6 doesn't contain significant changes to the expectations for collectible and specialty electronics. Core Requirement 7 focuses on data security. All R2V3 facilities are required to maintain a data sanitization plan. This is found in the core requirements that apply to everyone versus the appendices or process requirements that will only apply to certain organizations. So yes, everyone needs a data sanitization plan, even if they don't currently plan or receive materials containing data. They have to have a plan that meets Core 7. There are prescribed subject matters in Core 7 to be included in that sanitization plan. There's also requirements for a written data security policy, including assigning a competent data protection representative. And they have that identified as a a term, and you can see that defined in the definition section as well. Risks of theft and unauthorized access need to be considered within the security program for the R2V3 facility. Core 7 requires levels of security permissions for controlled access as relevant to the types of equipment received, the nature of data managed by the organization, and any applicable legal and other requirements. Those are to be authorized by the data protection representative that I just mentioned. Core 7 also requires written acknowledgements be maintained for those with security authorizations. It requires an incident response procedure for investigating potential or actual breaches, and a defined process to demonstrate that the destruction processes are 100% effective. So this is different than a sampling for, say, wiping. Devices can be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor with a written contract if they've been verified according to Appendix A, and that's in instances where the sanitization and/or destruction is not being conducted by the R2V3 facility themselves. Core 7 requires at least annual internal data security and sanitization audits to be able to validate the data sanitization processes, and these need to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. Core 7 also requires a process for providing information to suppliers upon request, including who their downstream vendors are for the data-bearing media that's coming from their facility, as well as any security breaches. Core requirement 8 of 10 covers the focus material expectations. The requirements include demonstrating the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities needed to process the focus materials. It also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when the R2V3 facility is not the final point of processing. According to Appendix A, this is to include international shipments through final disposition or the first R2V3 certified tier. In R2V3, alkaline batteries not containing mercury would not be considered focus materials but would be managed under Core 2 along with print cartridges. So that's a change compared to R2 2013. And another change is that even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials in R2V3. Core Requirement 9 focuses on facility requirements. Indoor processing is required, except in instances where outdoor operations have been adequately assessed for risk and release potential is controlled. Indoor storage and labeling requirements for R2 controlled streams are required, as well as indoor storage of reuse items unless they're intended for outdoor use. Appropriate insurance coverage is addressed in Core 9, as well as closure plan expectations. A new requirement in R2V3 compared to R2 2013 is the need to include the use of appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics under their control. That wasn't specified in the previous version, but you will find that language in R2V3 to ensure that even in the event of closure or abandonment, the electronics are managed in accordance with R2V3. R2V3 implements or introduces, I should say, some exceptions for the need to hold a financial instrument to cover closure costs in the event of abandonment. You have to meet all 3 of these criteria to qualify for the exemption. Total closure costs could be no more than $10,000 US. The size of the buildings owned, leased, used by the facility would be less than 1,000 square meters, and the R2 facility never accepts equipment or material containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. The final core requirement covers transport expectations. The language includes a reminder to package for transport in a secure manner that meets the Core 7 requirements, as well as in compliance with Core Requirement 4 for any legal requirements, any import-export requirements, to be in conformance with all applicable requirements. If you are transporting data-bearing media or components, there are additional security expectations, such as instances where sanitization or destruction is being conducted by a downstream vendor. It also requires the accuracy of codes, descriptions, etc. in the shipping documents and labels. That concludes the 10 core requirements. We'll quickly go through the process requirements or the appendices and move on to the rest of the material. I'm going to spend less time on the appendices as they don't all apply to all organizations. You can work with your salesperson, your consultant, and/or your auditor to fine-tune your appendices. If you have any questions about their applicability, Siri's knowledge base website also has a number of tools to help you better understand the appendices and assess whether they may apply to your organization or not. Appendix A covers the downstream recycling chain requirements. It outlines the focus material plan expectations, the due diligence requirements, the import-export evidence requirements, the transparency expectations for being able to track and demonstrate the recycling chain. You can also, with R2V3, register a portion of your downstream recycling chain with Siri in lieu of some of that tracking expectation found in Appendix A. There are different requirements in Appendix A based on whether your downstream vendors are R2V3 certified or not. If they're R2V3 certified, there is significantly less due diligence that is required. Appendix B covers data sanitization. This would be logical and/or physical beyond what is noted in Core 7. There are additional things to be included in the data sanitization plan, additional expectations including training, security. There are details about what physical destruction methods meet Appendix B requirements. There are software requirements for logical sanitization. There are sampling expectations. All of that is spelled out in Appendix B for clients who qualify for either logical sanitization, physical sanitization, or both. Appendix C covers the test and repair expectations. If you're qualifying for Appendix C, this is one of the process requirements that requires a quality management system. So if you already have RIOS, that has a quality component covered. If you have ISO 14 and 45, you would be looking to add ISO 9001 or one of the other quality standards spelled out on Siri's website. Appendix C requires a written R2 reuse plan with prescribed criteria to be included that talks about how you'll test the material, how you'll verify the effectiveness of the testing, what the return policies are, really specific to your organization and the types of electronics you receive. It requires that materials be processed within a year of receipt. Again, if they have been tested already or inventoried, that's not subject to a limitation of a year of storage. And test result records need to be maintained for each item and each functionality of each item. Appendix D covers specialty electronics. If you are qualifying to Appendix D, you also need Appendix C, which means you'll need a certified QMS as we just discussed. Appendix D details criteria and verifications in lieu of testing where the R2 facility lacks the technical capability to test those special electronics. So if this applies to your organization, you could certainly review this in more detail. I've included some additional information should it apply to your organization. This is not one of the more common appendices. Appendix E covers materials recovery, and there are different types of materials recovery. Qualification, we see manual dismantling, and we also see other types of dismantling, or excuse me, recovery, such as crushing, shredding, smelting. So we've got two different categories here based on the specific processes the organization is conducting. And what this requires are additional environmental health and safety controls for these higher risk material recovery related activities. And it's written in Appendix E with verbiage that indicates as applicable. So for an organization who's doing manual dismantling, perhaps their assessment of their risk indicates that only some of those EHS controls are relevant based on their processes and the types of electronics they're managing. These might include hazard and risk assessments, maintenance, pollution liability insurance, or guaranteed reserves, or some type of government guarantee to cover potential environmental incidents. This would be in addition to what's spelled out in Core Requirement 9, and evaluating the material recovery outputs according to the REC and Core 6. The final appendix or process requirement is Appendix F for brokering. This applies to the sourcing of electronics or components directly from the upstream to a downstream vendor to ensure that those R2 requirements are still fulfilled. This is another appendix that requires a certified quality management system. Most downstream vendors, most clients qualifying to Appendix F will certainly have Appendix A to demonstrate how the downstream vendor is processing those electronics, how they have verified that the downstream vendors will meet R2 requirements, processing those equipment or components on their behalf. So the brokering R2 facility is still responsible for Core Requirement 4 evidence of conformity, utilizing the REC and ensuring that transportation requirements are met throughout the recycling chain, security, tracking throughput, packaging expectations. What they would not be subject to would be Core Requirement 3 and Core Requirement 9 if the R2 controlled streams never pass through the broker's facility and they don't accept material at a given facility. So sometimes we see clients that brokering is their entire scope, and other times we see instances where they have a facility, they broker certain types of electronics, so they never come to the facility, but they do accept other types of electronics and process them through other appendices, in which case 3 and 9 would apply to their facility. I've included a couple slides as well as an FYI about the REC, but we're not going to spend a lot of time going through that. The R2 equipment categorization document is the framework for evaluating electronic equipment, components, and materials, and categorizing their R2 status throughout each step of the process. Cosmetic, functionality, data sanitization, and so on. The status or grades or categories from the REC are to be accepted by other R2V3 facilities. And while CIRI prefers that the R2V3 facility utilizes the exact categories out of the REC, it's also acceptable to use a cross-reference with the organization's own categorization system, showing how they correlate to those in the REC if it is appropriate and equivalent. Categories, of course, do not replace detailed descriptions. I've included a table of contents to show you the structure of the REC, and I've included some snapshots to give you an idea of what you'll find in there. We see the processing categories, including Table 1, which covers R2 applicability. This is a great starting point. R2 data sanitization statuses. Again, we assume it has data until we know it does not. Different functioning product categories, including cosmetic descriptions, functionality descriptions. There is a blank section about specific equipment categorization that perhaps Siri will utilize in the future. There's some additional information regarding cosmetic category, the range of categories and what that might look like, linking functionality in cosmetic categories, and so on. A couple other things I'd like to quickly bring to your attention come from the Code of Practices, which is a Siri-controlled document rather than the standard itself. So the requirements in the Code of Practices relate to the certification bodies as well as to clients, and you'll see as your certification body how some of these requirements are conducted by the certification body like PJR. The Code of Practices, for example, requires contract or readiness reviews to be conducted by the certification body prior to a stage 1 or an R2V3 transition audit to ensure the candidate facility is eligible for R2V3 certification. PJR calls this the contract validation. Changes were made to the certification structure options in R2V3, so you may see some new terms, some restructuring. Excuse me. That is dictated by the Code of Practices. One surveillance audit per 3-year cycle is allowed to be audited virtually if a client is a good candidate for virtual auditing. The Code of Practices requires that minors and major NCRs have specific deadlines for closure, for implementation evidence to be provided to and accepted by the certification body. It also requires that all R2V3 NCRs have a revisit to close those NCRs, whether they're minor or major. They can be remote or on-site. They don't allow off-site revisits, but luckily we can utilize that virtual option in some instances. And there are no allowances currently in the R2V3 standard. I've included slides that go over the certification process for anyone who isn't familiar with what that might look like. The first step in pursuing certification to a given standard is always to get a copy of the standard itself so you can understand and see for yourself what those requirements are. You'll then need to establish documentation that meets the requirements of the standard and implement those expectations, conduct the training, have your internal audit, conduct a compliance evaluation, conduct your management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as Perry Johnson registrars to conduct your audits, and you'll need to submit any pre-qualification documentation or information that your certification body is requiring. Again, I mentioned that contract validation process. So PJR requests certain information in advance of that activity to facilitate the contract validation. Following completion of the contract validation, you would have your stage 1 and stage 2 audits for your initial certification. This isn't the same as transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3. And we'll talk more about those audits on the next slide, but you do need to address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate can be issued. So we have that contract validation activity I mentioned that is conducted off-site. Depending on whether you are a new client or a transitioning client, that would be either a quarter day or a half day time. Your stage 1 audit evaluates the readiness for stage 2. In some cases that can be virtual. If any nonconformities are identified for R2V3 during the stage 1, they do need to be resolved before the stage 2 audit can proceed. That is a change for R2V3 in the Code of Practices as well. The Stage 2 audit is required to be on site for R2V3, required by the Code of Practices. And again, if any nonconformities are identified, they would need to be closed and resolved before a certificate can be issued. That's the full system audit, making sure that all of the requirements have been sampled to show conformity to R2V3. The Code of Practices requires that to be on site. And as I mentioned earlier, a revisit would be required for any nonconformities identified per the Code of Practices. Once certification has been issued, it's good for 3 years. You enter the surveillance audit cycle over the following 2 years. These can be semi-annual or annual audits depending on your contract, and those represent partial system audits, not as in-depth as a stage 2, not necessarily covering all of the requirements of the standard, but a sampling to cover all of the requirements over the course of those 2 surveillance years. The third year in the cycle would be the recertification audit, which is closer to the stage 2 in that it's a full system audit once again that would result in a new certificate. Once any nonconformities are closed, recertification audits for R2V3 are required to be on site according to the Code of Practices. I know I went through that very quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had time for a couple of questions. So if you haven't already done so, please type your questions into the question box. And I'm going to skip to the next slide so you can find my contact information. If anything is perhaps more organization specific and it would be better to talk about it offline, you can find my email address, amatthews@pjr.com, as well as being able to reach me through the main PJR number. They can put you through to my extension if we need to discuss something offline. If you are a prospective client considering R2V3 certification, I've also included the number for the sales department to go ahead and get you started or answer any questions you might have. I'm not seeing any questions that have come through so far, but I will hang out in case anyone is typing. Otherwise, thank you for joining us today. I hope if you've got an R2V3 audit coming up that this overview was helpful. I encourage you to review the CIRI knowledge base website, which can fit a lot more information than I can in an hour-long webinar, and you may find the answers to some of your questions there as well. If you are considering R2V3 certification, again, I hope this information was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me should you have any questions. I'm still not showing any questions. The webinar today was recorded, and a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording will be uploaded to PJR's website. You can reach me by phone or email should you think of any questions later. Thank you so much for joining us today. Since there are no questions, I'll be signing off. Good luck at your upcoming audit, and tune in to future webinars to learn more about R2 and the other standard certifications that PJR offers. Thanks so much.